I've always been someone who loved being in the woods, being alone most of the time. When I was young, I always went camping in the most nature-fied places I could find. I never thought much about aliens or otherworldly creatures at all. But one day, I saw these things that I just can't really explain. I must have been 8 years old when I first had my encounter, and my second encounter was when I was about 18 or 19. Well, for the first encounter, it was a great day. I was with family camping at our lot, riding four-wheelers and just enjoying the great outdoors. All in all, everything was normal. I had my camera on me and was taking so many pictures trying to capture memories. The camera I had was one of the old-fashioned wind-up ones, only limited to about 15 or 20 pictures, so I tried to save them for the most important moments. Night soon fell, and nothing really happened, but I did get yelled at once for the flashes coming from my camera. So I put my camera away and started hanging out with my cousin Dakota. Earlier that day we found some clay and were messing with it, and we started making random items with it. I wanted to take a picture of one of them when they dried. At this point I realized I only had one picture left to take. DK and I were sitting there talking about what we might do the next day, when I saw what looked like the moon in the sky. It was bigger than I've ever seen in my life. But then that all changed when I noticed that it was moving. This wasn't the moon, and whatever it was not making a sound, just gliding across the night sky. I wouldn't have noticed it, but the trees were helping me see it move. I went to take a picture, but for some reason my camera was jammed. So I just sat there in awe and disappointment, asking Dakota if they saw that. I pointed, and he started freaking out, trying to get the adults' attention, but they were too drunk to care. He and I could only stare up at this orb, the size of the moon, slowly gliding. I felt like I was stuck in the moment. Then, as soon as it passed behind another tree, it never came out the other side. The thing just disappeared. I believe what we saw that day was a UFO. Later on, I looked back up in the sky to try to find the actual moon, only to realize that it was a half-moon night. This is when I started thinking that we may not be alone. Now, Dakota and I rarely talk about that day, but the memory's so real. When I talk to people about it, they don't believe me, but I know what I saw, even if my explanation for it is wrong. Now, let me tell you about the second and closer encounter. I was around 18 and I was alone at this point as well. I'd had a rough day and I was fighting off stress and sadness. The only way to calm my mind was to go for long walks in the woods. Now, as you know, I've been in the woods at night a lot before, and I didn't care about it being dark. I didn't care about being alone in the woods. And I was walking on one of my favorite trails, a trail that I nicknamed Comfort Trail, just because it calmed me down a lot. I had my headphones in and 2 knives on my belt, just in case. These knives were more of a peace of mind thing, because if anything bigger did attack me, I probably wouldn't stand a chance, but it still felt better to have them compared to nothing. Anyway, I know the woods pretty well. I could go off path and go straight home if I wanted to. So I'm walking down the path with headphones in, loud as can be, playing Skillet. But as it was, I couldn't hear anything beyond those headphones, but I was fine with it at that point. Until I felt like I was being watched. That feeling, it gives me goosebumps just thinking about it. I felt my hair stand up and my body tense up, and with one motion I took out my headphones and turned around, knife drawn. I was certain that I was being followed, and it turns out, I was right. When I turned around, about 5 feet away from me, only 5 feet, was this creature. It was far from human, and it was standing on 2 legs like I was. We both just stood there looking at each other, waiting for each other's next move. Now, the creature, it was standing up, and was bent over on one hand as well, with the left hand by its head. It wasn't making a sound, it was just staring at me, eye-to-eye contact. I have to say it could have been 8 or 9 feet tall, as I'm 5'6" and it towered over me. We both stood there in our own defenseful poses. Something told me that it was as scared as I was. And then, in a split second, It bolted off in one direction, so I bolted in the other, running straight through the woods back to my house. When I got to the edge of my yard, I turned around and stared into the woods. I didn't hear a thing, no birds or frogs even, not even a cricket. Looking back on it, if that thing really wanted to kill me or hurt me, it would have done it with ease. There's no telling how long it'd been following me so close before I decided to turn around. I was kind of mad at myself, because if this thing didn't want to hurt me, I could have tried talking to it, but I was too scared. I promised myself that next time, I wouldn't just run away like a wuss. This event occurred during April of 2016. It was on a plot of hunting land outside Richland Center, Wisconsin. Richland Center is a small town in the hilly terrain of southwest Wisconsin. It has a population of about 5,000 people. The plot of land set around 15 miles outside the city. It's away from people so that we don't have people snooping around or breaking into the cabin, since it could be easy to find. The land was owned by my father's friend James, and was fairly large. Exactly how many acres, I don't know, but it was definitely a large plot of land. The cabin is about 20 yards into a small patch of woods just off the road. Beyond the cabin there is a cornfield that sets in the curve of the U-shaped woods we use for hunting. There is a ridge that runs across the center of the field, sloping down on each side at a steep angle. At the midpoint between the woods and the cabin is a little island of trees. It's only about 20 feet in diameter with a deer stand in it. This location will be important later. Now that the background is out of the way, I can begin my story of my encounter with what I believe was a Wendigo. Me, my father, James, and another of my father's friends, who we'll call George, and George's son Elliot, all went up to the cabin to cut firewood for the hunting season. The first day was filled with work in the chilly air of a long winter. We cut down 2 very large old oak trees on the left side of the U, and we ended up losing a few large logs in a ravine after they rolled away from us. So the work overall took us up until sunset. After all, we hadn't arrived at the cabin at all until around 1 in the afternoon. Elliot and I were down in the ravine carrying the logs up the steep side, and then up the hill to the ATV where we loaded them into a trailer. A total of 5 logs had to be brought up, each of which weighed nearly 70 pounds apiece. After they were all loaded into the trailer, George drove across the cornfield. Elliot and I made our way across the field on foot. The sun was just above the hills on the horizon, casting our shadows over the treetops to our left. I scanned the tree line for deer as we walked and saw nothing, and then I noticed something strange. The woods weren't alive. No squirrels, no woodpeckers, no crows cawing as they always did. The wind was even gone, and the trees stopped swaying. In all my life, I've never seen anything like this. I mentioned it to Elliot, but he didn't seem to care. At this point, we were about to pass the island of trees, when I noticed movement out of the corner of my eye. Hoping it was a deer, I turned my head to see nothing, but some barren bushes rustling slightly. I scanned them hard as I continued towards the cabin, but I still saw nothing. But I felt as if there was definitely something out there, something watching. As I turned away, I felt like something was staring a hole in the back of my head, so strongly that I had to itch that spot. We finished the night by watching some Jerry Springer and Maury Povich on the television while eating frozen pizza. I fell asleep later on the pleather couch instead of my bunk. The couch sat adjacent to the window that looked out over the field. The blinds were only halfway open, and soon I woke up with the urge to pee. I looked outside, and at first I saw nothing, but as I studied the thick briars across the way, I saw something among them. The moon casted long, thin shadows over what I made out as a face. Whatever this thing was, it was excellently camouflaged in the light of the full moon. It had pale grayish-white skin, and it was squatting in the brush like a frog, legs cocked out and rear near the ground with its spindly arms in the ground in front of it. I watched it for a few minutes, and that whole time I didn't feel the burning of eyes on me. It was like the thing was taking in the environment, watching everything except the inside of the cabin. After a few minutes of being dumbfounded about what this was, I remembered that I needed a pee, and dang all that beer I had drank. I opted for an empty water bottle instead. Fiddling around and still trying to watch the thing in the brush wasn't a good combination. I wound up looking away for a moment, and when I finally looked back, the thing was gone. And my heart began to pound when I realized that I couldn't locate the creature. I finished my business, then forced myself to lay back down on the couch, burying my face in the cushions. Before I knew it, I was awake in the morning to the smell of bacon frying. Nothing in my mind from the night before. I got up and ate my breakfast, and we all prepared for another hard day of work. Then we left around 9 a.m. and headed back into the woods to cut down another handful of trees we had marked. We cut up 2 on the east side of the forest. Then we marched directly across the field to the location of the final tree we had planned to cut up. We reached the tree line and were overwhelmed with the smell of iron. It took only seconds for us to notice the bright red pool that had melted away an area of snow. There before us was a disemboweled coyote impaled through its neck on a low-hanging tree branch, its insides sitting on the ground. "Well, what?" James shouted. "That man is a freak," he continued. My dad turned to him and asked, "What do you mean? Who did this?" James then explained how the man who owned the land that borders the north end of the woods is disputing where the border actually is. The man had become much more upset as of late, since we had just set up a new hunting stand on his supposed land. As we went deeper into the woods, we found more eviscerated animals, all of them hung up the same way as the first one. James became increasingly more and more angry, and eventually he left us to cut up the last tree. He took one of the ATVs up to the neighbors. Elliot and I weren't happy about that, because without the ATV, that meant we would have to haul the logs by ourselves on multiple trips, or we'd have to pull the trailer by hand. We opted to run a utility rope around the trailer and wrap the ends around our waists to pull it. We were basically sled dogs at that point. We made it to the cabin in around an hour, but it felt like we just played an entire football game twice over. James was back and he was outside talking to my dad and George. They all seemed a little upset, but as I watched, Elliot didn't appear angry, he appeared shaken now. He was saying that the man wasn't even home, but that he found more and more animals eviscerated the same way, even some of the man's pets that he had seen before. There were dogs, horses, goats, strewn everywhere across the man's property. We were all now sure that this wasn't the work of the man. "We need to call the police," James shouted. "There's got to be a bear, wolves, a rabid dog, something that needs to be put down. Maybe it's some psycho or deranged animal." We calmed him down and began to logic it all out. If it was an animal, none of those animals in the woods, no matter how deranged, would impale them on the branches. Nor would they have simply been torn to shreds like that. Animals don't do that no matter how hungry they are, or aren't. Not even a rabid dog could do that. My dad finally made the decision to call the police and stepped away from us to do it. I couldn't gather anything from listening, as it was mostly my dad acknowledging the dispatcher with an "uh-huh" and the occasional "okay." Finally he hung up and came over to explain what the dispatcher said. The on-duty officers are tied up right now dealing with an overturned semi, and that they're trying to get an off-duty to come out here. But it may take up to an hour for anyone to get here at all. They suggested that we lock up tight and head into town. Then we can call back and see if they got an officer out there yet. Everyone agreed and headed inside to gather a few things for the night. I loaded my bag with a change of clothes and toiletries and was the first one out. As I waited for the others, I realized that all this nervous waiting made me need to pee. I walked over to the fence that ran behind the trailer, and I began to relieve myself. Just as I finished my business, I looked up and froze. My blood ran ice cold, and my knees felt like they were going to give out. My insides felt like jello. Because staring at me from over the top of the fence was something I wish I'd never seen. I could see the upper half of a face. The skin was a gray-white, saggy, and its features were sunk in. And the worst part were the eyes. They weren't black pits, as I've heard others describe similar things, but they were instead deep set and a glossy black that I could see myself in. I could not bring myself to move. It felt like an eternity before the others came out of the trailer. James called out to me since I was just standing at the fence not moving. "Hey man, we need to hurry." And then his voice crackled off as he saw the thing too. Its eyes turned their attention from me to James, and the invisible hold it had on me broke as I fell onto my butt and began to scramble away from the fence. I was just screaming, trying to tell everyone that we had to go now. But all that came out of my mouth was some sort of scream. James opened the tailgate on his truck and grabbed one of the axes we had from splitting the logs. "Get," he yelled at it, shaking the axe in the air above his head, as if he was trying to scare a dog away. But this thing simply stared back at him for a few seconds. Then suddenly, as if to challenge him back, it let out this ear-splitting screech. It sounded like a mix between someone skinning a live cat and the sound that the predator from those movies makes. Then it lowered and disappeared beneath the fence again. I'd made my way to James' feet and basically was crying and snotting all over his boots. Everyone had heard the commotion and ran outside. They had heard the screech as well. They were all questioning what happened. Instead of standing around and wasting time explaining, James told everyone to get back in their vehicles and drive. I jumped in the driver's seat of my truck without hesitation, and my father got in next to me. We calmly exited the property, not bothering to close the gate behind us. But as the dirt soon turned to pavement, there was nothing calm about our driving. We hauled tail out of there, quickly approaching a stop sign at the end of the road the land set next to. Now please understand that I have no idea what possessed me to do what I'm about to tell you. I was a fairly new driver at this point, and I placed blame on the fact that I was very particular about following the rules. So instead of driving straight through that stop sign that's set in the middle of nowhere as James did, I slowed to a stop and checked for traffic. Then as I went to step on the accelerator, I looked in my rearview mirror. Bathed in red from my brake lights was that creature, and a dead sprint for my truck. As I stopped on the gas, I couldn't tell if the screech I heard came from the creature or my tires. My dad next to me would later ask why I did that, and I tried to lie to him, telling him that I didn't want the deer to hit the truck that were coming. But there were no deer there, and my dad knew I was lying, especially when I was screaming like a little girl the entire rest of the way. We made the usual 20-minute drive in about 10, due to me traveling down the backcountry roads at speeds in excess of 90 miles an hour. We decided that we would meet at a local bar, and we would wait until we got a hold of a police officer, or were kicked out of the place. Soon there was an officer sent up to investigate the land the next morning, and not much came of it. It was ruled that the animal carcasses were due to a rabid coyote, despite the fact that coyotes can't pick up and impale other coyotes and animals on tree branches. I honestly couldn't believe the bullcrap excuse I was hearing. James and I have kept what we saw behind that fence to ourselves since that night. I refuse to talk about it with my dad, and whenever he brings it up, I just tell him that we don't know. We returned to that land later that year for the annual deer hunt, and made it through 2 weeks without incident. However, I fear that the 2017 hunt might not go the same way. I pray to God that I never see another Wendigo creature or thing like that again, for as long as I live. I live in Estes Park, Colorado. Normally my family and I go camping out of the middle of nowhere, because we're literally so close to the mountains. But after this, I'm begging my parents to get out of here, move to the city. After what happened that dreaded night, I just want to be on the opposite side of the world now. It was around a week ago when my dad said we were going camping. I was really looking forward to it. I'm an outdoors person. I love going into the wilderness. I like seeing things that maybe other people hadn't seen before. When we arrived to the middle of nowhere, I suddenly felt uneasy. It wasn't a feeling of being watched. No, this was more like nausea, like I needed to throw up. Eventually, it went away, and by the time we were setting up our tents, I felt normal. Fast forward to the next day. I remember waking up around 4 a.m. in the morning, and I remember getting the same feeling again, but 10 times stronger. I had no other choice but to step outside for some fresh air. I regret that, because as soon as I got out of my tent, I saw something terrifying. It was a creature crawling on all fours, in humanoid shape, with skin that appeared to be melted and a deformed head, and even though it was hunched down, it was taller than I was. When I saw it, I began praying internally, hoping that this thing hadn't saw me. I slowly stepped back into my tent. I just went quiet for the rest of the night, until a few hours later it was dawn and everyone else was getting up. Luckily, the rest of the day went on normally, until nighttime. My dad and I were outside around the campfire. We were staying up especially late that night. It must have been 2 in the morning then, when all of a sudden we hear a screech so terrible and demonic sounding, we honestly thought it was going to make us deaf. Instantly, what came to mind was that thing I saw the other day. So I told my dad to pack, that we had to leave. Unfortunately, he didn't seem as worried as I was, so we didn't leave until the next day. It was a long and terrifying day for me, but finally we packed everything up and left. And before we drove away, I was looking through the vehicle window when I saw the thing again. Its eyes were enormous and lifeless. They were staring through me, filling me with shock and dread. That dirty, raggedy skin made it look worse, but we drove right past it and away. We got home and my family were watching a movie. And when we finally went to bed, that night, I felt the same dang feeling again. For what seemed like ages, it seemed to never go away. I just lay in bed, unable to sleep. Eventually, I admitted defeat, so I got out of bed and went downstairs to grab a glass of milk and some Oreos to calm myself. All of a sudden, I hear that same screech again from when we were camping. In pure shock, I grabbed a knife and ran to my bedroom. I stayed away from the windows and locked everything up. But only moments later, just outside my window, I heard what sounded like large centipedes crawling over the walls. If this was the same thing as before, I had no earthly idea as to how it could be making those sounds. It wasn't until sunup that those sounds finally went away. Right now I'm typing the story out at my aunt's house in Denver, and I think I'll be staying here permanently. If I could have it my way, I don't think I'd ever go back. Let me begin by saying this. I'm nowhere near a good man. My life has been full of terrible things that I'm not proud of. I can't say I deserve a quiet, peaceful life, but I don't think I deserve what I was given in place of that. It seems like a normal life, a beautiful girlfriend, a loving family, and a wonderful dog. But people looking from the outside in don't know what else decided to enter my life. Let's go back many years ago to the 5th grade. I was a troubled child, always fighting, always doing what I wasn't supposed to. I always had my best friend by my side though, through thick and thin. One night we decided to have a sleepover at my house. We were playing video games to the early morning hours. My friend passed out way before I did, which was no shock to me. He always seemed to fall asleep first. I just kept playing the games and eventually fell asleep too, with the game still running in the background. I woke up to my friend frantically yanking on my shirt, nearly squawking about the window. Of course, being the courageous kid I was, I went over to the window and looked. There was nothing but the sun rising above the trees. I walked back over to him, calling him a few choice words for waking me, then walked back over to the couch where I was sleeping. As soon as I went to lay back down, my heart sank, because I heard a terrible noise. A light tapping on the window. A tap, tap, tap. Then a long screech of the glass as a long white finger ran down the window. We both stood still in shock until he broke and ran up the stairs to where my parents were and proceeded to tell them what happened. They simply dismissed it as a childish scheme or nightmare. Well, fast forward to my junior year of high school. Nothing had changed. Bad behavior, police involved, horrible things done. But that's not the worst of it. The thing from all those years ago, showed back up after all that time. There would be a tap on my window here and there. Then something more. You see, I got a dog, and at every night at 10 p.m. sharp, I would take her out to do her business. But on one of these nights, she simply wouldn't budge. I tried to get her out of the door, but she began growling and snarling at the big oak tree in the yard. Hair standing on end and teeth bared, she looked to be ready to defend herself. Now this wasn't a little rat dog. This was my Neela, a 60-pound female German Shepherd. I have never seen her so vicious, it was unsettling to see. In the most confident voice I could muster, I called out, "Who's there?" As if on cue, the same hand from that night in 5th grade reached out around the trunk, the same long white fingers and pale patchy skin. My dog bolted back inside while I stood there staring. For 5 or so minutes I watched the hand. Then it retracted and was gone. Fast forward a few weeks and I was going to my car. I had begun dating this girl and she decided Sunday was our date night. As I walked out, I felt I was being watched. Then the feeling stopped and I heard a twig snap and my heart dropped as I turned to see it standing there in full, finally completely revealing itself. It was massive, but I don't mean muscular, I mean tall, very, very tall. I'd say 7.5 feet. This thing was bony, ribs showing, and it was thin. Its skin seemed paler than ever, almost as if it was rotting from its body. I wanted to cry, I wanted to run, I wanted to just die. It filled me with such dread to see this. A car alarm went off nearby and it drew my attention, and that's all it took. I looked back and the creature was gone. Fast forward to present day, it's been 4 years since then. Things only got worse after senior year. I went downhill even more and the thing showed up more and more too. It showed up the same time, same place, every Sunday night at 10. It would be by the tree. It terrified me. No matter what I did, it would always be there. I hadn't been a scared person in my life until I saw that thing. That thing taught me true fear. One night, it got worse than I thought it could. The thing would stay outside letting out blood-curdling howls, tapping on my windows, and worst of all, watching me through my house windows, no matter where I went. It was like I couldn't get rid of it, that it won't go anywhere. It feels like it's my punishment for things I've done in my life. I don't know what it really is, but I've called it by one name and one name only. Karma. Life's way of saying you won't get off easily. Suffer for what you did, for who you are. It won't leave me. And now it seems Sunday isn't the only night it shows. It's there no matter what. And I think I deserve it. Because what goes around comes around. It was a Friday evening and I was out biking. I had my dog with me, Lucy. She's 120 pounds and has blonde fur with a dark snout. I love that dog. We were on a bike trail and I always carry a gun in my bike pouch just in case. It's a revolver and it was easy to aim. Suddenly, my bike flipped over and I was on my butt in pain on the middle of the bike trail. As I flipped over, my gun had flown out of the pouch and was now laying by a tree nearby. My dog was close behind me and sniffing my face after I fell. I got up and looked at what made my bike flip over. It was dark and hard to see, but something was in my tire. I pulled it out and it was wet. It felt like fur. So I turned on my flashlight to get a better look, and I nearly threw up. What I was holding in my hand was a bloody deer's foot. It didn't take long for my dog to find the rest of the deer. It was within the trees only a few yards away, and it looked like someone shredded it in some sort of shredder. The thing smelled like death and urine. I threw up, got back on my bike, and picked up my gun. Then I rode off, ready to go back home. But seconds later, there was a massively loud pounding coming from behind me. Something was tearing up the trail, approaching fast. I pedaled harder, praying that I didn't flip again on some rock. Soon the sounds were right behind me, and stupidly, I turned to get a look at it. It looked to be some sort of wolf, but this thing was bigger than me on my bike. This wasn't some animal I'd ever seen before. I thought I was going to die. I rode faster and faster, denying the rest that my exhausted body begged for. Suddenly, my tire in the back popped, and I flipped over again onto the road. This time when I landed, the moment I could, in tears, I scrambled to get my gun. I took it and was ready for whatever was about to happen. I looked at my tire, and there was a huge gash in it, like a claw mark. But the thing that had been behind me, it was gone. Then suddenly, the woods were filled with a howling scream that was coming from the nearby forest. I ran the rest of the trail as fast as I could. My car was 10 minutes away. That 10 minutes was the longest 10 minutes of my life. When I reached my car, I got in, let Lucy jump in the back seat, then floored it out of there, never looking back. And ever since then, I have not been back on those trails. This story is not my own. It came from my mom's friend. In Mexico, any sort of Latino would be familiar with the term duende, which means gnome or troll. I've personally never seen one myself, but after hearing this story, I definitely don't want to. My mom's friend used to live in this little town called Michoacan, Mexico. There was this huge house at the corner of the street. They called it the Castle House. This castle house was abandoned for many years. One of her friend's mom had the key to the house because she was related to the man who had owned it. One day, out of curiosity, they decided to steal the key and sneak into the castle house. They opened the door and stepped inside. Now, I need to say that while she was recalling the story to me, I could visibly see that she had goosebumps all over her arms. Anyway, as they were walking around exploring the house, they hear a noise and instantly turn towards it. They see what looks like a human, but it's only half a foot in height. They screamed and it startled the little creature. So the creature screamed as well, high-pitched and louder. It terrified them. It started running really fast around the room. Their eyes followed this gnome as it made at least 3 laps around the room until they didn't see it anymore. The creature had simply vanished before their eyes. After processing what had just happened, they ran out of the house and never went back. They were too scared to even walk by the house to go to school anymore. As they had stolen the key and broken in, they never told anyone. They thought that no one would believe them anyway if they did. She says that she will never forget the terrified face on that small creature, and she'll never forget the screams of pure horror that came from her, her friends, and the duende. One little summer day, I was in my house. It was dark and maybe midnight on Saturday. I'd just gotten back from Wisconsin. It was almost complete silence, save for a few cars going by. I was getting ready for bed, but out of nowhere I hear something walking around the house outside. I figured that maybe it was my neighbor, because I live in a townhome. Anyway, I listened as it got closer to the garage. I can tell because I'm on top of the garage in my room. I look outside, and right across the street, walking on the road, was this long-legged creature. It would walk from house to house, stand tall, and peek into people's windows. Everyone's windows were closed and blocked with curtains though. But it was still so creepy to see something like that trying to spy on people. Well, my bedroom window wasn't blocked with curtains, so right away, I was terrified. I was trying to convince myself that I was seeing things, that it wasn't real. Even still, I went around my house locking each and every window and door, making sure everything was shut. Then I went back to my room and locked that door. Then I tried to sleep, and it took me several hours, but finally sleep came. The next morning I wake up, and I can see kids riding their bikes like any other day. So I decide to go outside after I brushed my teeth and ate breakfast. When I went outside, I saw blood on one of the trees. I was scared, and I remembered hearing the tree shake, and it sounded like bark getting scraped off a tree. I wondered if it was from that creature. I wondered if that was even real. I tried not to think about it, but I never could stop. It was the most terrifying thing that had ever happened to me. And I'm still curious if when I finally fell asleep that night, if it looked up into my window and watched me.